Please welcome the panel on The Emerging World of Opportunities, Insights from MI's Global Opportunity Index, moderated by Director of Global Market Development at the Milken Institute, Carol Bio.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. I know that we're maybe the last item between you and President Bill Clinton, so we'll keep things very dynamic and exciting for you. So, as you heard, I'm Director for Global Market Development at the Milken Institute, and we're here today to discuss a topic that you will all have heard about throughout the conference, which is global opportunities. Specifically, the Milken Institute works hard to understand ways how public and private capital can be better mobilized towards investment, innovation, economic growth, and opportunity. And all of that is centralized in a lot of the work we do at Global Market Development, working with policymakers and investors across emerging markets, and in our flagship publication, the Global Opportunity Index. I can't take credit for the publication itself. My colleague Maggie Switek is the head of research and has developed this index over the years, but this is a 10-year publication covering about 130 countries, 100 variables, and shares a lot of insights as a tool for investors looking to invest in different markets, and for policymakers as well, trying to shape and better attract that investment. So here with us, we have an amazing panel from across the world that can help us dig deeper into the different markets covered by the index, specifically looking at opportunities in emerging markets. So today, you can see here the parts of the different pieces of the index, but before we go into that, I want to introduce our wonderful speakers. So we have Jared Glansbeek, who's CIO of Riskura, joining us from South Africa. We have Richard Jadulan, who's Chief Financial Services Officer of the Central Bank of the Philippines, and also one of our World Bank Milken Institute scholars, currently completing the program in London. We also have Leticia Jauregui Casanueva, who is founder and managing partner of Avalur Ventures, based in Mexico. And we have Dr. Toyin Sani, who is joining us as founder and executive vice chair of the Emerging Africa Group, based in Nigeria. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. Thank you. So today we have time for a conversation. We also have about 10 minutes at the end for any questions that you may have. Please put them online. They will come through to my iPad. We also have questions from the live stream, so we'd encourage you to just scan the QR code that will show up on the screens from time to time if you have any questions for our panelists. So as we get started, you can see the index in front of you. There's 5 main categories: business perception, economic fundamentals, financial services, institutional framework, and international standards and policy. And so we'll keep just going back to some of these standards and these categories as we talk about the markets we're looking at. And suffice it to say that there's a strong positive relationship between the scores that countries have on these indices and the foreign direct investment flows to different countries. So we'll start at first with the Sub-Saharan Africa. I have to say I have a bit of a bias, having spent 17 years myself in Kenya, and a lot of the scholars from the programs we run are from Africa. So let's start with South Africa. So if we could take a look at slide 4. We'll see here, this is the different regions covered by the Global Opportunity Index, and you'll see that in Africa, that's the last box, the scores are lower, but there's also very wide dispersion, and the 2 little dots that you see at the top are the outliers, which are Mauritius and South Africa. So South Africa does particularly well for itself on the index. It's ranked 51st. And especially through strengths in institutional framework, financial services, and business perception. But we've also heard, there's obvious infrastructure challenges now. There's high levels of educated youth unemployment, and there's a lot of different challenges that investors and businesses are grappling with. So, Jared, I know Riskura is obviously engaged across emerging markets, but you started it in 1999 in South Africa. Can you give us a bit of your current take on the investment opportunities and the landscape for innovation and business in South Africa today?
Sure, thanks. And thanks for having me. I think, those dots look fantastic there, and there is a lot to be positive in South Africa, and in fact across the emerging market region. I'm not sure I would see it quite as negative as this, as some of the lower box items. But let's just talk about SA. We all know high unemployment, issues around governance, corruption, schooling, institutions, and we talk about infrastructure, and I would say you have to be careful about which infrastructure. Obviously the most important one is power, and that's an issue, and transport. If they mine, they can't deliver, and that's an issue. So these are fundamental issues. There's a lot to be positive about. Just banking system is very strong. At the moment, a grey listing issue, but I don't think that's going to be too permanent. I don't think that'll be an issue. Companies are very good. You have access to skilled labor. In various nodes, you've got a very positive environment. So ultimately, I think when you're thinking about, and maybe just the last thing to mention, there's an election now, which is pretty much like the rest of the world. And that there has some potentially tricky outcomes, which people are well aware of. And I think this is something that everybody needs to be cognizant of, all emerging and frontier markets. Ultimately, there are great overview summaries like this. But everyone, when you invest, it's either debt or you buy into a widget maker. That widget maker produces widgets and they sell. And so if you go and you buy exceptional widget makers, then that's obviously really what you want to be doing. And I think in that sense, South Africa is great. Everyone talks about the stock exchange, pretty big. 70% of those stocks have nothing to do with South Africa. So when people think about whether they should invest, you really need to actually understand the underlying instruments. And there are lots of entrepreneurs, and I think you can see that all over the world. The upbringing of people is really economically to street fight. So you have to street fight. And obviously someone from South Africa is obviously now street fighting with SpaceX and the like. So that the culture is one to actually entrepreneurship is really important. And I think there are a lot of positive things that are happening around developing youth employment and staffing. There are things like YES schemes, which are really designed for companies to bring in young people, train them up, and you get points for that. So there's a naturalization law, but you get points towards that. And there are a number of things that, including, every company is doing something in that sense. We're doing an incubation scheme. So, for instance, we're pushing asset managers with gender lens, as well as, by the way, with previously disadvantaged people. And it's really been about making sure you get entrepreneurs, take entire middle office and fit it in for them, so that they can actually operate as asset managers off the back of that infrastructure, and then assist them to get assets. Our client base is mostly emerging markets and frontier markets. It's about 250 billion, so it's big in that sense. It's obviously not big worldwide, but we're using a lot of that muscle to actually get our clients to pay for these services for these individuals. So we get around things like conflict of interest, etc. So lots of good ideas to really push things, and ultimately lots of good cheap assets. You come in through a currency that it's 30% cheap, into a company that's 30% cheap. The whole story is actually quite good. And I think as investors, you have to put the price along with this.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. And we'll come back to some of the pieces around youth development and diversity and inclusion as well. So I'd like to then move on to Africa's second largest economy in GDP terms, third largest stock exchange by capitalization, and largest by population size. So Dr. Toyin Sani, you previously headed a Nigerian investment bank, the first that was listed on the stock exchange, and then you founded Emerging Africa Group. And Nigeria's overall ranking on the index is, of course, much below South Africa's. It's 114, and this score is pulled down by some low scores in international standards, financial services, and economic fundamentals. And many of us are aware that the macroeconomic situation in Nigeria has been quite difficult recently. But you have lots of reasons to be optimistic. So I would love to hear a little bit about your optimism, including what the administration currently is doing to help attract more investors and to improve the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I do confirm that I am optimistic about the outlook for Nigeria as an investment destination. And my optimism is based on let me start with three key pillars, two of whom you have alluded to, but I will expatiate. And the first one is that we currently have a new administration that is determined to reform Nigeria significantly. So we have a reform-minded administration that is working on $1 trillion economy in the next 1 decade. And the work cuts across. Let me start with, again, some of the very important parameters we're looking at. So if we look at financial sector, we have reforms starting with the recapitalization of the Nigerian deposit money banks. The last time we had such a recapitalization was in 2005, and it not only did it succeed in growing these banks by over 1,000%, but it also brought in significant foreign direct investments. And these investors have been smiling all the way to the bank in the last 2 decades. So I would say to you that if there was a time to look at Nigeria, and by the way, if you look at the performance of our Nigeria exchange, you'll find out that the financial services sector actually continues to be a major contributor. This is an exchange that year to date has already returned over 31%, and this is an exchange that returned over 45% last year. So back to the point, there is a lot of work being done in terms of the financial sector. So beyond the recapitalization of the deposit money banks so that we can increase their capacity to underwrite large ticket transactions, there is also the fact that we have taken the bold step, the Nigerian government has taken the bold step of unitizing the foreign exchange regime. Prior to now, we had multiple exchange platforms, so to speak, and these have been unitized, and that provides transparency, that provides more access to foreign exchange for investors. So that's a second reform. And the third one that I will talk about in financial sector is the fact that the federal government has instituted a private sector-led tax and fiscal reforms committee that is working actively to remove a lot of the constraints that have constrained investment and business growth in Nigeria. And these include elimination of multiple taxes, duplication of taxes. Then I would move to the energy sector. And I would say that one of the bold reforms that Nigeria has been crying for prior to now, and perhaps we didn't have the political will to implement, is the withdrawal of petroleum subsidy. And again, we have an administration that has decided, to take this on head-on. And what that means is that it introduces efficiency into the system. Very importantly, it helps to preserve, our economic reserves that had been going to, a lot of this. So then I would go to other reforms, and in the infrastructure space, we have current infrastructure projects, including major rail and road projects. There is a major road project that is supposed to go from Lagos, which is the economic capital, all the way to Calabar, which is like on the border of Cameroon. Now, if these projects, and the government is showing commitment to these projects. So those are some of the reforms that I see that I believe will make a difference and move the needle with respect to Nigeria. The other 2 points you mentioned earlier, the sheer size of this market cannot be ignored. So we're looking at over 200 million people. We're looking at a demographic. Anyway, I will talk a little bit. I know it's part of the questions for the last time. But if you look at the share size of the market, and then you look at the size of the economy itself, and you multiply by the potential for returns, you realize that you really cannot be talking about investing in Sub-Saharan Africa without, looking at Nigeria. So I guess I will pause there. Thank you.
No, fantastic, and we'll come back to those demographics afterwards. So thank you so much, Toyin. So we'll move to a different region, Latin America and the Caribbean. The region stands out in the Global Opportunity Index for very strong economic fundamentals, driven by a very strong environment for future growth. And so when we look at foreign direct investment from 2018 to 2022, the bulk of it goes to Brazil and Mexico within the region, a little bit more to Brazil, but the inflows to Mexico have been particularly stable, including through the pandemic. And there's actually been a really strong uptick in equity from about 80% increase between 2018 and 2022. So lots of positive momentum and investor interest in Mexico. So Letty, over the past 16 years, you've been focused on disruptive innovation and investment. You're an angel investor yourself, and currently with Amalur Ventures as well. So could you give us your sense of the entrepreneurship and innovation ecosystem in Mexico?
Of course, thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us. Hopefully you're already investing in many of these regions that, as you can see, are very dynamic. There's huge opportunities in these emerging markets, and specifically for Latin America, I would say there's a few challenges that I'll talk about, but I want to stress that a lot of these challenges can be interpreted as opportunities as well, and there are many, many opportunities. And so specifically in terms of challenges, we are very strong on the economic fundamentals, we are very strong kind of on foreign direct investment, et cetera. There is lower perception and scores on the business perception side, the financial services side, and international standards and policy. And obviously there's some differences across the region. There's a clear exception with Chile that's very strong across the board. There are also exceptions on the financial services side with Brazil, for example, that is huge on the fintech side with Nubank and with other financial players. But specifically, if we dive into the financial services piece, I think we've seen growth and improvement on the financial inclusion side, but we haven't necessarily seen improvement on the financial health side. And I want to give a few examples from Mexico. So 49% of adults have a bank account. And there's really interesting players like Coppel, like Tala, that is also present in the Philippines, for example. But 90% of the population says they live day to day. So they finish the money by the end of the month. They don't have extra money to save. They don't have anywhere to invest in alternative financial products, et cetera, et cetera. And then 70% of Mexicans feel financial stress and insecurity. So even though we've been improving on the financial services side, there is a lot of opportunity and a lot of things to do. And then finally, I think on the challenges side is inequality. We see huge financial and economic inequality. We see inequality on the digital front with higher penetration of internet, but low usage of that internet, and not necessarily the type of broadband that they need to be able to get into the digital economy. And then finally, a lot of gender and kind of rural inequality that we can talk about later as well. In terms of opportunities, as I said, they far outweigh the risks, I believe. The first opportunity that I see is talent. Because of geographical location and temporal kind of proximity to the US and within the region, there's a very high quality of labor supply that allows for real-time collaboration. So we are seeing huge growth in hiring of engineers in Mexico and in Latin America from US companies, a lot more exchange and collaboration within the region itself. So I think that in terms of talent is a huge opportunity. The second area where I think there's huge opportunity is during the pandemic, we saw huge tech adoption. We saw digitization of a lot of financial services, e-commerce grow, and there's a growing middle class. So I think there's huge opportunities for new startups, for investment, and even though general funding has fallen compared to 2021 levels on the VC side, for example, it still has gone up 13% year on year in 2023, with a lot of flows going to Brazil and Mexico, also Colombia. And so I think there's a lot of excitement there. And then finally, I'll say for me, one of the biggest opportunities is obviously with the reconfiguration of supply chains and value chains and the nearshoring opportunity, or allyship, as it's been called as well by Milken Institute. Mexico today is anti-fragile. No matter what happens geopolitically, we're going to be in a good position to catch more foreign direct investment, to have better entrepreneurship, to develop more innovation, and to participate more actively in different kind of value chains. And I think that is a very compelling case, together with strong macroeconomic indicators, together with a strong talent pool, together with, I think, very strong interest on the business and the government side to enable this type of innovation.
Thank you. And the nearshoring is definitely something, the friendshoring, that we've been, as you said, working on at the Milken Institute as well. So happy to maybe dig into that if you have some time. So we'll turn to emerging and developing Asia. We'll see on slide 3 that the region has received over half of total FDI going to emerging and developing economies in the blue there. Of course, a lot of that goes to China, but the levels going to China in most recent years have dropped a little bit because of the geopolitical uncertainties. So Richard, you're joining us from the Central Bank of the Philippines, where you're Chief Financial Services Officer, and as I mentioned, very glad to have you as one of our scholars for our scholars programs, currently completing an 8-month program in London. So the Philippines ranks among the top 10 in emerging developing Asia, but and it scores 91st globally. But the scores are brought down by poor business perception, institutional framework, and financial services. And arguably, improving on any of those would really increase and enable you to capture more of that 53% over there. So could you please tell us, from the perspective of the central bank, as a policymaker on the stage with us, what is being done, and starting off with business perception, in terms of improving that going forward?
Sure. Thank you very much, Carol, and good afternoon to everyone. Yeah, you're right in pointing out that the Philippines, while we form part of the top 10 in emerging and developing Asia, we are actually ranking just 91st out of 129 countries in the overall Global Opportunity Index. And that is also a reflection that there's really a dispersion even within the emerging and developing Asian economies. Like we have Malaysia at 27th, Thailand at 37th, and then we have Philippines at 91st and Cambodia at 93rd. And as we can see, the flows here, a lot of them went actually to China, which is ranking at, I think, around 39th in the index. Anyway, for the Philippines in particular, I understand we need to do a lot of work in terms of business perception, institutional framework, and the third one would be on financial services. Yeah, and I would like to talk first about business perception. The country has actually been addressing this regard, and we have, in the recent years, we've had a number of legislative and regulatory measures about this. The most important, I think, was the recent passage of the Ease of Doing Business law, which involved, for example, shortening the time of processing of business permits and automation of some government services, as well as standardizing the processing time for government transactions. So that would at least improve how the way the investors would perceive when they open businesses in the country. And another legislative measure was the amendments of our investment laws, and that means foreign investors are now able to own 100% of certain public services in the country, which used to be restrictive. Like we had a sort of a cap of the percentage of ownership that foreign investors can have, but now they can own fully of them. Like for example, air transportation or communication. And something that's a little bit closer to my heart is what the Central Bank of the Philippines, or the BSP, does, which is the continued liberalization of our foreign exchange regulations. So we've actually been doing this for like over years already. And I think the most recent one would be the doing away with the registration of certain capital flows, because it used to be when there are certain capital flows or foreign direct investments and even foreign borrowings, we had to like require them to be registered within the central bank. But now we've done away with this in an effort to at least liberalize and to improve the way the investors perceive on capital, and eventually to improve the capital flows in the country. So far, that's it for business perception.
That's great. Thank you so much, Richard. And if we just look briefly at the other two, the institutional framework and financial services, is there anything you'd like to share on those two?
Sure. On the financial services, I would like to talk more about the financial inclusion, which the BSP is leading along with the other government agencies in the Philippines. So the financial inclusion journey of the Central Bank of the Philippines started like in early 2000s when the BSP has declared microfinance as a flagship program for poverty alleviation. And in that time, we have like sort of mainstream microfinance and issued a number of regulations about this. So we had microfinance on agriculture, micro housing, and even micro insurance. And after that, the BSP has expanded financial inclusion to eventually promote access to a wider range of financial services. So that's when we had regulations on electronic money, and then we have also strengthened financial consumer protection, which is important as well. And then we have modernized our national retail payment system. And in the more recent years, the BSP has emphasized the importance in harnessing data and digital innovation, and that is when the BSP has participated in efforts to, for example, issue a single national ID system, and we have also participated in terms of formalizing the digital transformation roadmap for the country, where we are aiming that 50% of retail transactions should become digital eventually. And then in the aspect of institutional framework, I do agree that I think this is the area where we need a lot of most work on. But maybe I can mention that in terms of budget transparency, which is important for institutional framework, I think the Philippines is kind of doing well in this. We are ranking among the leading in the Southeast Asia in terms of in the open budget survey. And yeah, maybe we can also talk about incidents of corruption. And yeah, I do acknowledge that we are ranked poorly in this. I think in the world global corruption index, we are like ranked 118 out of maybe 180 countries. But still, we're doing a lot of things on this. For example, we have came up with the anti-graft laws. We have created an agency that focuses on corruption, on fighting against corruption. We have the freedom of information, and then we're also coordinating with the United Nations on this as well. Although I must say that we have yet to see some more of tangible impact from these measures, but I think overall I'm optimistic on this.
Thank you so much, Richard. And if you could briefly pull up slide 5, and this is a shameless plug for the programs that we run at the Milken Institute for the Scholars Programs. I don't know if it's coming up, but part of the idea is to really build good governance and the next cadre of leaders, that would be slide 5 if we have it, to really build financial markets and lead their countries in an ethical way as well. So you're part of that next guard, Richard. So I'm sure we'll see those scores going up on the institutional front as well. And then that's very briefly if you want to take a look at our scholars programs. So now, Jared, I want to go back to you. So we've done our global tour of these different markets, and now looking at it from an investor perspective, what sort of tools, what sort of instruments, what decisions in terms of portfolio allocation should investors really be thinking about? When we talk about Africa in particular, people mention often the gap between reality of risk and perception of risk. Is that really what's holding people back, or is there another lack of understanding gap that you can help clarify for us?
Okay, sure. So I think the first thing just to point out is that, again, our client base of hundreds of billion dollars is invested. Mm-hmm. So I think the first thing to start off with is people are investing. Now, most of it is local, but what I find particularly interesting about that client base is a lot of that client base is quite comfortable to invest in developed markets and other emerging and frontier markets. So and these are institutional players with governance as good as CalPERS and anyone else. So I just want to point out that there are people investing across these regions, and it may be that they're more comfortable with the risk. You know, they understand the currency risk, they understand the inflation risk, they can work around corruption, they understand the underlying investment. So there's a very large investor base which invests across all these places, including Africa. So the problem has really been, and we've done a lot of work on this, has been getting developed market investors to invest in any of these emerging and frontier markets. And I just want to point out a few things. So the first one is that the local markets have been good. If you're a developed market investor, you haven't really had to worry about performance. So that's the first thing. And that's been a big impediment. The second thing is that, and I find this very interesting because it's theoretically flawed, is that risk is apparently binary. Now, what I mean by that is if you don't like something, you do not invest. And if something doesn't feel a little bit right, you don't invest. Now, when you're looking at risk management and there are a number of exceptional opportunities, but there is risk, then what happens is when you actually put in a portfolio, to put 0.1 or 0.2% in these even broad-based investments actually is really good for the portfolio. But what's interesting is that people just say, look, the check is too small. Now, if you're in any of these emerging and frontier markets, to get 0.2% of the total US capital market, you'll be okay. Yeah. You'll be okay. So I find that quite interesting, and it's this mismatch in really understanding what risk management is. Next one is no boots on the ground. What we found is a lot of the institutional investors, they have a governance, you have people coming in, and then one of the trustees puts up his hand and says, excuse me, what about X, Y, Z? And there are no boots on the ground with the consultants or anyone else, so no one has an answer. So what do? You kick the question to touch, someone else must go and manage it, and then you have to wait for the next meeting. So actually, the entire governance problem becomes an issue that you can't implement. Yeah. So that's been an issue. The next one, and this is where we believe that the times are changing quite quickly, is that you want to invest next to local investors. Now, we have many of those investors, and so what we are trying to convince people is, we're not just this furry consultant that you can speak to. You can actually stand next to the person putting his dosh in the ground, speak to them and understand those portfolios with them. So that's pretty interesting. And then the last thing I want to say on this is that when you think of the local markets having done quite well, at the same time, when you're looking over your shoulder and you're seeing what these markets have done, they haven't done anywhere near as well. Yeah. However, and I'm going to give the African example because it's quite an interesting one. We have a mixed private equity portfolio. It's got venture capital, so it's quite mixed, and it has 150 stocks in it. And if you look at the earnings growth of that portfolio since the financial crisis, it has outperformed NASDAQ. The earnings growth, and as you're all investors, earnings growth, good earnings growth is good. If you look at that earnings growth, it has outperformed, and it's outperformed on many of the sub-periods as well. So when you look over your shoulder, why has it done it so badly? Well, sentiment, multiples. One of my colleagues always says multiples, and I should always say multiples, not ratios. But when you look at the PE ratios, they were the same at the credit crisis. Now they're half, or even less than half. So what happens? You plug that into the formula and you underperform. But that's temporary, because as we know, earnings growth drives companies, and this you can see across the entire region. You've got to have managers who can deal with the detail and then can actually manage that. So that's 5 problems. I've just outlined 5 or 6 problems, so that really is what is the bar that you have to get over. But I don't think that's impossible.
Thanks so much. And one of the objectives that we have at the Milken Institute is to increase the dialogue around opportunities outside of developed markets for investors. So we're launching an Africa Leaders Business Council and other efforts, including our dialogue with Brazil and Mexico, to try and put those regions more on the map for investors who might not otherwise be aware of the great opportunities set. So thank you for outlining that. Does anyone else want to? You're all investors in different ways. So does anyone want to sort of weigh in on that? Letty?
Definitely. What we've seen in Latin America across the board is a huge growth in the VC industry. Private equity also has been growing in the region with very good results. And I think what's interesting is not just why developed economies are not necessarily looking at these, but to the earlier point, if they're just going to invest a small percentage, it helps diversify that risk. It helps provide bigger returns. For the regions, it tends to be a lot bigger investment than many others, and really makes a big difference. I think what's interesting, though, is if we talk about inclusive investment, then what happens when you start to look at a breakdown for female entrepreneurship, for example, and investments in women. And what we're seeing, at least in the case of Latin America, is about 27% of founders are women, and they get about 13% of capital. But if we think about teams that are female-led only, then that goes down to about 2%. And less than 7% of VC checks are written by women. So I think there's also an opportunity to start to promote more diversity, emerging managers that might additionally add better performance. There's a lot of interesting reports that show that female entrepreneurs are outperforming their counterparts. BCG has done really great work on this, McKinsey as well, and I think that is something that is not just the case for LATAM, it's prevalent across regions. We see that in Africa, obviously. We see that in Asia as well.
Thanks so much for bringing that aspect. That was actually going to be my next question to you, is around the role of women and which is captured in different areas of the index, of course. So in Mexico, actually, Mexico has the lowest rate of female labor force participation of all the countries we have here, at around 45%, and the highest rate of male labor force participation. And Nigeria does the best of the countries here, steadily at about 50% female, over 50% female labor force participation. And that's only one piece. In Mexico, the growth of small and medium enterprises is being driven by women. Yeah. So definitely it's a huge question to look at. And I know that both you and Toyin, you've also been a very, very strong advocate and involved in this, of women not just as employees and investors, but also and owners of wealth. So do you want to maybe tell us what sort of the rationale is for you to even start Emerging Africa Group, and your views for women in Nigeria and in Africa?
Thank you so much. And I'll start by confirming that we have a significant participation of women in the Nigerian labor force, over 50%. Also in terms of entrepreneurship, Nigeria and many parts of Sub-Saharan Africa have the largest proportion of female entrepreneurs anywhere in the world. So we've got these women who are determined to create value. We have found that a lot of women have proven to be good stewards of resources, been successful as CEOs and executive directors. Nigeria's largest banks are the commercial banks. Right now, 10 out of the 26 MDs of commercial bank CEOs are women in Nigeria currently. About 30%, we have 30% participation now by women on the boards of the Nigerian banks. But we need to see women set up and grow large businesses. And so talking about my motivation for setting up the Emerging Africa Group, the motivation is essentially to give an opportunity for the ones coming next to us. My daughter works with me. She's in the room. She's the one taking my picture there. I want her to know that whatever the men can do, women can do as well. And so the motivation for me is to see, women set up businesses that become as successful as the public entity that I used to run and grow, and give opportunities for women to participate in board and management. We can also talk about the youth. You can't talk about Nigeria and Sub-Saharan Africa without talking about the incredible youths that we have. So we have a youth population that is, we have a population that we have 70% of the population under the age of 30. And we're looking at not just youths that are not making a difference. We're looking at youths that are fighting against all kinds of odds to make a difference. And if you look at the digital space, the financial technology space, those youths are doing incredible things. I'm very proud of the fact that out of 9 unicorns that have come out of Africa so far, 5 of them have come out of Nigeria. Very proud of the fact that our youths have been dominating both the film industry and the music industry across the continent and grabbing the attention of the rest of the world. A lot of what we've talked about with Taylor Swift and Beyonce and the Barbie movie makes us, and of course we're here in Beverly Hills, so we know the potential of the creative industry. That's a space that we have not even looked at when you consider the potential of the African youth. So for me, these are topics that I'm very proud of, very passionate about, and I think if we remove a lot of this institutional, obstructions, there's a lot more wealth that can be created with youth and women.
Fantastic, thank you. And the creative economy, if anyone is interested, there was a panel earlier today that you can then catch. And around that, some of the institutional pieces there and legislative pieces are also around intellectual property. So that's something that's definitely going to be front and center for that industry as it develops further. So thank you also for bringing up the youth. So there's, of course, the intersection also between youth and technology that that is you're very keen on in terms of also advancing education in addition to the importance of and the access to entrepreneurship. So Letty, I know that previously with your role at Meta, you headed global partnerships and education. Can you tell us a little bit about the lifelong learning and how globally the populations you've worked with and how they're leveraging technology for education?
Definitely, and before I jump into that, I just wanted to add a few things about that gender perspective. In addition to what was said, I think in the case of Latin America, we also have a young region. The median age is below 30. Urbanization is above 80%. Fertility has been trending down, so we're at 1.85, so that obviously will have an impact on labor markets and will have an impact on the future of the region. But if we think about the talent pool, which is strong and growing, in the case of Mexico, for example, we graduate 130,000 engineers per year. We have about 700,000 developers that are participating in global companies. And so we have a huge competitive advantage in Mexico and the region. But if we think about female participation in that, less than 20% of employed professionals in engineering jobs and in tech jobs are women. And if we think about how many women graduate from engineering, depending on the type of engineering, it goes from 57% all the way down to 11%. So we also need to think about how we start to move women up in that skilling and in those educational opportunities. And then if we think about micro and small businesses, which are the vast majority of the companies in the country, it's not startups, unfortunately, it's not impact entrepreneurs. 97.4% of companies in the country are micro enterprises. And many of those are owned by women, and those women are the ones who are generating most of the jobs for other women. So about 70% of jobs that microenterprises led by women create go to other women. And the reason that happens is because they tend to be more flexible. However, they're more flexible because they're in the informal market. And so informality, in the case of Latin America and specifically in Mexico, also leads to a lower participation of women in the labor force. It leads to lower access to financial services. So female-owned microenterprises tend to have only 11% of loans that are available to micro and small businesses, and those loans tend to be smaller than those that go to men. So I think there's a vicious cycle that isn't necessarily allowing women who are creating a lot of businesses to grow as fast as men, even though a lot of evidence and data shows that they're performing at very high levels. So I'll stop there with my very passionate interjection about women to jump into that part of along kind of lifelong learning and skilling. When I was at Meta, I used to lead a fund around the intersection of education, immersive technologies, and AI. And something that we saw across all of these regions, so a lot in Nigeria, in India, in Brazil and Mexico, there's a lot of young people who are coming into the augmented reality and virtual reality sectors and who are becoming creators, not just consumers of these technologies. And I think there's huge opportunities for each of these countries and the regions to really become leaders in a kind of spatial computing, in immersive technologies, and there's so much that we can do in terms of how we skill them. And if we think about upskilling and reskilling, I think obviously with AI, this is something that's at the top of the mind of any person that has a large business. Today, the average half-life of skills has gone down to 5 years. So that means that all of us, whatever skill we learn, we're going to need to update it in 5 years. And if we think about tech skills, that goes down to 2.5 years. So any of your employees that are getting skilled in new technologies need to get reskilled every 2.5 years. So that means there's a huge need for upskilling and reskilling opportunities. We need to leverage technology to do that. And there's many different ways in which we can do that. At Meta, there was a firm belief, obviously, that we can do that through mixed reality, virtual reality, augmented reality, and AI, because it's proven that that can shorten distances. You can bring a lot of experts to anywhere in the world within seconds. You can make people feel like they're in the same room and learn in a very constructive way. So reskilling and upskilling really, for me, are strategic imperatives for any business today. And if you're not investing in that, then you're gonna lag behind. And the final thing I'll say about that is about 68% of workers today are aware that they need to be reskilled or upskilled. So it's not that your employees and people in the labor force are not aware, they just don't know how to get there. And so there's going to have to be a lot of emphasis put on change management, on soft skills, to make sure that people are finding the ways to get upskilled and reskilled so that they maintain their competitiveness, so that they can stay in the labor market, and so that we really can leverage young people in a lot of these regions and continue to see the regions grow.
Thanks so much. Jared, would you like to add anything to that in terms of the incubation work that you're doing, or working, be it with youth or with women, but sort of trying to get them more involved in the work that you do?
Sure. I think maybe just as a starting point, and this is a generalized starting point for all our clients wherever they may be in the world, and again, just to remind you, that's mostly emerging and frontier markets, is that all of them recognize, we deal mostly with institutions, so it's pension funds, insurance, sovereign wealth, etc. What they all recognize is that you can build this pot of gold up for retirement for everybody, but if you walk out the doors into retirement and there's a fire on the streets, and in fact there are no streets, it's an issue. And part of that concept for us has been saying, well, if we have to fast forward 20 years and you've got a thriving financial market where the professionals are diverse across, let's just say, racial groups, gender, etc., then essentially what decisions do you have to make today to get there? Because otherwise we all get there and we say, oh, we haven't done anything. So what are those steps? So one of the key issues that we saw, and this has been across the board, is that the people who are managing the money are often getting on a plane and flying in. And if they're local, then generally it's a lot of men. And this is, these have been problems, and a lot of old men. So what we've tried to do in incubation, sorry, I'm one of those guys. what we've tried to do is recognize that we have to actually incubate younger folk to actually be able to take this role over, so that they become those seasoned professionals later on. And to do that, we look for a few things. The first thing is we look for people that are exceptionally smart and passionate. We are global experts on understanding how those portfolios should look. So if we can find people who are good enough to say, I prefer widget A maker over widget B maker, then we can work with that to construct a portfolio. And essentially that's been the role, is we've put in a middle office, so that people have reports, they have systems, etc. They can pull the trigger depending on how markets change. And we've allowed them or given them all of this at no cost to themselves. That cost is all to the clients who've given them assets and enlisted us to help these folk. And I think that's been an amazing thing. So one of the things you may have heard of is AWIF. That's something that the UN launched with us, and a bank called Standard Bank, and that's been quite successful. I mean, I hope it's a lot more successful. We have about a $2 billion incubation program in South Africa. We've got, we started one many years ago in Namibia. There's one in in Botswana, and so we've tried to do this. And at the end of the day, the clients are happy. They're all fulfilling their SDG goals. They've adapted those SDG goals to local circumstances, and in all of this poverty alleviation and capacity building, this is really what they're doing. So it's been a wonderful road, and as one of the people that's really pushed this, I'm so proud of what some of these people have done. Great performance. I had one more story. I had one of the women entrepreneurs or managers came to me and said, and it wasn't a very big portfolio, she says, look, I'm feeling a little embarrassed because I'm not sure that I'm doing well enough, and I've had a few problems with one of my companies. So I said, well, how are you looking? Give me a helicopter view. No, she's just got everything valued externally, and since the beginning of her first fund, her IRR is, I think, 26%. And I said, look, let's go into the details, but that's not a bad place to start. It's a wonderful story, and seeing such passion and people actually implementing this in portfolios. And the big gain is that then they go on to Fund 2, and that's really a wonderful place to be.
That's amazing. Thanks for sharing. That sounds like a lot of perfectionism there. If 26% or is not good. Great. So I think we have about 10 minutes left. If anyone wants to submit questions, please remember to scan the QR code, and we'll turn to you. But I did want to address one other critical element of what within our index falls within the economic fundamentals and the environment for future growth, which is of course climate. It's been addressed at other points during the sessions, but a lot of emerging and developing markets, and Africa in particular, but also small islands and also including the Philippines, are at high levels of climate risk. At the same time, climate can provide quite a unique opportunity for new types of investments, new growth. So I want to put that to the panel in general. Maybe turning to you first, Richard, some of the work that in the Philippines you've been doing from a policy standpoint to increase finance into the climate sector?
Yeah, sure. Well, first, we recognize, in the Philippines, we really recognize that climate risk is a really important thing to talk about. In the past weeks, we have had a record very high temperature, and as the world would remember, back in 2013, we had one of the worst disasters in human history with the Typhoon Haiyan. And I think that has awakened policymakers in terms of placing importance on climate risk. And even us at the central banks, we are putting more action in terms of sustainable investing or sustainable central banking. One of these is in terms of policy and regulation is we have issued regulations that would influence or direct banks to incorporate sustainability in their different investment activities. And in the group where I am part of, which is financial markets, where we do manage our reserves, we have invested a portion of our reserves in the green bonds of the BIS investment pool. And I think that is also setting an example also for the other financial institutions in the country to follow suit in terms of investing in these types of assets. And we have also tried to improve our capacity building. We've signed up to a number of organizations like the National Association for Greening. Yeah, and we've signed up on that. And we have also participated with some measures within the region, like, for example, in the executive meetings of East Asia Pacific central banks. We have moved forward in terms of Asian bond market development, not only on the regular government issuances, but we are now investing already on the green bonds that are issued within the Asian region.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jared.
Yeah, I mean, this is a hugely interesting thing. Sorry, I'll be quick. Sure. So 2 points. If you look at the African continent, what happens is, just because of its shape and the nature of the currents, is with global warming, the gearing on temperature is for a global 1%. In Africa, we experience 3 times that. So what we found is our institutions are being quite militant on dealing with SDGs and climate change and sustainability. Second point I want to say is, from that, what we've had to recognize is for a place, for any of especially the frontier markets, when the Politerati think about what's important for their people and they put together a growth plan, they realize that it's far more important that one of their citizenry can put food on the table. That's a bit more important than a puff of smoke here and there. So there's been quite a lot of work that we've done with those governments to convert their growth plans into SDGs. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to change the rhetoric from lots of institutional investors from developed markets telling these markets how they should invest and be sustainable to, look, this is what's important to us, but here we're communicating it in your language. And it's actually been a really interesting thing in a number of countries.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing. And Toyin, I know that you've been involved with some green bonds as well as part of Emerging Africa Group.
Absolutely. So sustainable financing has never been more compelling than it is today. It's no longer a nice to have. It's a matter of the survival of the entire planet. And indeed, temperatures in Nigeria, as you can imagine, have been really high, extremely high, and the other disasters that are associated with climate challenges. So how we work is to support the power companies that we work with to raise green bonds and other forms of funding that is built on sustainable types of power. Okay, and then with the SMEs, because I will say something that may be a little bit controversial, but we need to say it. And then we also work with SMEs to help them to finance their own power transition, exactly what we did for ourselves as a company when we moved our premises from the grid to solar predominantly. And that is to recognize that development cannot wait. So the development of Africa cannot wait. And so even as we advance, sustainable financing and green financing as the preferred option, the alternative cannot be darkness and hunger. We have to find solutions that work immediately for the people of Africa, even as we transit to sustainable financing. My organization, Emerging Africa Group, is actually ahead of other financial institutions in Nigeria, and we are rounding up the implementation of the ISO 26000. So we're totally committed to sustainability all round, but we also have to speak that this transition must be a just transition for Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toyin. Letty, you haven't spoken on this yet, so.
Thank you. Definitely LATAM has huge opportunities around kind of the climate space, both to solve a lot of the challenges that we're going to go through as well with heating, with a lot of natural phenomena. In terms of renewable energy, with solar, with wind, with hydropower, across the region, there's mega projects that are really having an impact. And specifically, for example, around solar, the region is looking to augment their utility grade level energy by 460% by 2030. So there is a huge impetus to move towards renewable energies. I think, as it was said, it's going to be a slow transition. And across the world, we're seeing different investments in oil, in fossil fuels, as well as these investments in renewable energies. I think in terms of sustainable agriculture, there's a strong push across the region, and specifically in Mexico, for example, around organics, agroforestry, et cetera, and really making sure that practices around agriculture are contributing to better sustainability practices. And then finally, I think it's really important to think about forest management, conservation, and everything we can do to prevent further damage. And it's very exciting to see that within his first year in government, Lula was able to decrease deforestation by 34%, for example. So I think across the board, there's strong efforts. There's a lot to be done yet. Yep. In the case of Mexico, we'll see what happens with the new administration and reforms, but I'm hopeful that this will continue to be an area where there's a lot of investment. And the final thing that I'd say is, we need to think about, obviously, scaled projects, but we also need to see what happens at community level. Because to your point with SMEs, a lot of people are doing smaller scale projects that can have an impact directly on their day-to-day. And this is somewhere where, again, women are participating actively, not just from the kind of environmental justice side, but also in terms of implementing a lot of these solutions with solar energy in their communities, et cetera. And I'm excited that there will be a forthcoming report on the female labor force in LATAM that Milken is publishing, and hopefully we'll also see some of these different opportunities across different sectors that reflect what the opportunities are in the global index.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much all. I think there's been a lot of optimism conveyed throughout the panel, lots of challenges, but all of them carry opportunities. So whether it's climate, whether it's gender and inclusion, whether it's youth and the need for education, all of those are also business and investment opportunities and growth opportunities. It just requires, attention from the investor community, but also from government, which, as Richard has shown us, is that the attention is there. So I think we're leaving everyone with a pretty positive message. As a quick final round, and also with some tools, as you mentioned, Jared, in terms of the how to construct those portfolios and make those investment decisions. Just one word each of what makes you most hopeful. I am springing this on you because I haven't prepped you, but if there's anything, one word that you want to leave the audience with, Toyin, we'll start with you.
Well, I just want to say that you go where opportunities have not completely been exploited.
Yes.
That's where, at the end of the day, that's where the opportunity to build wealth is. So we may not have come through so well today, but if we're already there, chances are there is nothing for you to really exploit. So I would say when nobody else is looking at some of these markets, that's the right time when you need to be looking.
Amazing. Thank you. Letty?
It's two words, but young women. I think there's incredible opportunities to invest, to promote, to foster, to mentor young women. So thank you.
Great. Richard?
Yeah, I think I would recall with our conversation earlier with Mr. Mike Milken, and he emphasized about the importance of developing human capital and with technology. And I think developing these two would bring us to move forward more, and especially for the Philippines, and how we can improve the opportunities for investors and for the business community as well.
Thanks, Jared.
My few words, one word is valuation. So, if you look at Japan, and Japan had corporate governance issues, the revaluation of that market, because because of sentiment about governance has been phenomenal. I would suggest in these markets, valuation is cheap. That kind of bad governance is in places, but the same sentiment change will yield incredible performance. So it's valuation.
Wonderful. Thank you all for helping make our global conference truly global. And thank you for your attention. Enjoy the rest of the day and the fantastic both Bill Clinton and the closing concert. Thanks again for joining us.